Thank you all for taking the time to log on for this, and thank you to the library and the Walter Havighurst collection for organizing this. So my talk this afternoon will focus on the Nullification Crisis of 1832 to 33, which some of you might remember from high school history classes, which was a conflict between the US government and the state of South Carolina over tax collection, during which President Andrew Jackson was authorized to use federal troops to put down protesters. This event intersects with several themes today, including debates about the legitimacy of federal force, masks and the common good, and economic crises. This conflict also coincidentally occurred during a cholera epidemic. Now, before I go any further, I want to say that these are merely parallels. Despite the popular adage, history does not repeat itself. Not exactly, but it does give us perspective on our current crises. And this year is certainly filled with crises. Okay, so President Trump's recent deployment of federal troops in Portland, Oregon, and other cities under the Protecting American Communities Task Force, or PACT, to quell protests has a history. Let's first go all the way back to 1792, to the first Militia Act, which was passed by the Second Congress and empowered the President of the United States to take command of the state militias in times of imminent invasion or insurrection. This act was created because white Americans feared Native Americans would attack on the frontiers while Congress was in recess and thus unable to call out the army. President George Washington invoked this 2 years later when he dispatched federal troops to put down a protest over whiskey taxes in Pennsylvania. The act expired shortly after, but the president's power to call out the militia was made permanent with an updated Militia Act in 1795. Then, in 1807, President Thomas Jefferson took these powers further when he signed into law the Insurrection Act of 1807, which empowers the US president to call into service armed forces when requested by a state's legislature or governor to address an insurrection against that state, or, quote, whenever the president considers that unlawful obstructions, combinations, or assemblages, or rebellion against the authority of the United States makes it impractical to enforce the laws of the United States. Now, this act was addressing the issue of Aaron Burr, the guy who shot Alexander Hamilton, the issue of Burr raising an army to establish his own empire in the Louisiana Territory, but it is still on the books today and has occasionally been invoked. For example, it was used by President Grant in the early 1870s against the Ku Klux Klan, in the 1960s to enforce desegregation, in 1992 to quell the LA riots, and it was almost used in 2006 to justify federal intervention in Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina. And then most recently, in July 2020, when President Trump sent federal agents to Portland, Oregon to stop protests against police brutality. So when did and does the president have a right to deploy force? That question came up in 1832 and 1833 and resulted in the 1833 Force Bill, or the Bloody Bill as it was known by its opponents, which authorized the federal government to deploy military force to compel South Carolina to comply with tax collection. It did so after President Andrew Jackson had already begun secretly stockpiling federal arms without the permission of Congress to use against tax protesters in Charleston. So again, my talk will briefly describe the 1832 to 33 historical context of this states' rights versus federal force issue and discuss its possible relevance for debates over COVID and protests against racial violence. Many of the themes of the nullification crisis are relevant today, such as federal versus local power, secrecy versus transparency, lawful protests, public safety, and the common good. Okay, so on March 2nd, 1833, President Andrew Jackson signed into law the Force Bill, which authorized the federal government to deploy military forces in South Carolina, where the state legislature had recently declared national tax laws null and void. Months before Congress authorized the use of this force, Jackson was in secret talks with a political ally in South Carolina about stockpiling federal arms in case tax protesters became violent. So how did the situation come to be? Well, first we have to look at the situation in South Carolina. South Carolina in the late 1820s and early 1830s was addicted to cotton production and slave labor. Its economy was suffering. The Panic of 1819 hit South Carolina harder and longer than any other state. The state never fully recovered. As cotton production ramped up in the United States and globally, prices decreased, which had more serious ramifications for South Carolina than elsewhere because of a series of other challenges the state faced, such as soil erosion, outmigration, and a decline in Charleston's status as a port city. As many white South Carolinians felt their economic opportunities contract and their political power dwindle, they viewed national political decisions as an attack on their way of life. Kind of like today, how some Americans view stay-at-home orders as prohibitive of their well-being and financial stability. This became especially true in South Carolina when Congress passed a tariff in 1828 to protect American manufacturers. The legislation taxed imports, which indirectly upset the balance of trade between South Carolina and Britain. South Carolina found it too expensive to purchase the British manufactured goods they relied on, and the British subsequently had less income to purchase cotton. When Jackson was elected president in 1828 and did not repeal the tariff, as some opponents of the tariff had hoped, a radical opposition developed. A group of South Carolinians, led by Jackson's vice president, John C. Calhoun, so at the time, president and vice president didn't run together on the same ticket like they do today. So Calhoun, again, he's Jackson's vice president, he began arguing that South Carolina had the right to nullify the tariff, basically to not comply with federal law. This was like if Vice President Mike Pence today were organizing against President Trump. So again, no exact parallels. Okay, so in 1830, there was a political dinner to celebrate Thomas Jefferson's birthday, and Jackson and Calhoun each made their position on the controversy clear in what became this infamous toasting clash. Jackson raised his glass to the federal union, saying, quote, "It must be preserved." To which Calhoun replied, quote, "The union next to our liberty, the most dear. May we all remember that it can only be preserved by respecting the rights of the states," end quote. And with that interaction, the battle lines were drawn. That fall in 1830, the major issue in state elections in South Carolina was whether to call a state convention to nullify the 1828 tariff. Men who had common political and economic interests suddenly divided into two parties. Candidates designated themselves as convention and anti-convention, and eventually became States' Rights and Free Trade Party and the Union and States' Rights Party. So everybody wants to be states' rights. Both sides claim to be Jacksonian and to advocate for states' rights. Now, historians have tried to determine why exactly men who had previously been political allies divided over whether to fight for nullification or tariff compromise. Ultimately, the Nullification Crisis was a power struggle between different groups of elites who sought to realign political and economic power in their interests and manipulated the economic situation to do so. Interestingly, members of the legislature from both parties agreed on Jackson as the preferred candidate, just as they both claimed states' rights were good, for the next presidential election in 1832. But some nullifiers chose to abstain from participating in the campaign and the election. This was their way of making a statement about the futility of participation in national politics. This crisis did, however, have national ramifications. People in other states followed the conflict. Most Northerners wanted the crisis to end so that business wasn't interrupted. Southerners were divided, and there were attempts by both nullifiers and unionists to get other Southerners to ally with them. In 1832, members of both sides presented their case in Washington through both official and unofficial channels. Unionists submitted a memorial to Congress asking for a reduction in the tariff, hoping that if it were reduced, nullifiers would agree to pay it. Privately, they met with the major players in the tariff conflict: President Jackson, Secretary of Treasury Lewis McLean, and two influential members of Congress, Senator Henry Clay and Congressman John Quincy Adams. This involved lots of political wrangling and negotiations with Northern businessmen to come up with a tax plan that would be amenable to various interest groups. It was generally assumed, though, that congressional compromise would not be enough. So one unionist had a closed-door meeting with Jackson to strategize about how to get nullifiers to cave. Jackson offered up political offices for Carolinians who would agree to dissuade nullifier activity in their area. He also said that he would arrange for a collection of arms to be available for unionist use should the nullifiers become violent. The Secretary of Treasury, Lewis McLean, produced a report that was generally lauded as a successful compromise. But sure enough, it was still unacceptable to the free trade contingent. The South Carolina congressmen who voted for the compromise bill were branded as, quote, betrayers of the state by the nullifiers. Both sides turned to the media to make their case, publishing letters in the newspapers that either legitimized nullification or denounced it. They also collected voting data and organized vigilante committees all over the state to police voters of the other side. During the elections for state and city offices in the fall of 1832, violence was worse than usual. Gangs of nullifiers attacked men leaving Union party suppers. Both sides plied voters with liquor, which was common in all elections, but this fall, party leaders lured opponents with free alcohol and then kept them intoxicated long enough to prevent their ability to vote. Despite the best policing efforts of unionists, the nullifiers took the majority of state and local offices. In response, Jackson got more serious about surveillance. To keep an eye on nullifier activity in South Carolina, President Jackson had an informant on the ground named Joel Roberts Poinsett, who was a former South Carolina congressman and minister to Mexico, and the poinsettia is actually named after him. So Poinsett, convinced that the Charleston post office was overrun with spies, set up a secret intelligence network between Charleston and Washington. He also publicized arguments against nullification and in favor of using arms to put down the movement. However, the South Carolina legislature issued the Ordinance of Nullification on November 24th, 1832, which authorized the General Assembly of South Carolina to require that all civil and military state officials take an oath to obey, execute, and enforce the nullification ordinance and related legislation. So it essentially barred conscientious unionists who considered nullification unconstitutional from holding designated offices. And basically, it allowed the nullifiers to control the militia and to seem like the only legitimate armed force in the eyes of many South Carolinians. So when the nullifier governor, James Hamilton, called for a 12,000-man state army, Poinsett wrote to Jackson, quote, "I am decidedly of opinion that whenever the government is compelled to act, it should be done with such an overwhelming force as to put down at once all hopes of successful opposition," end quote. So Jackson sent 5,000 muskets and other military equipment to Charleston Harbor, concealed in camouflaged boxes. He then instructed military officials to refer privately to Poinsett for access to these weapons. Now, this is actually what got me interested in the nullification crisis. It's a well-known event, but when I was doing research for the biography I'm working on of Joel Roberts Poinsett, I saw all this secret correspondence with Jackson, and I was like, oh, so this is how politics was done. So anyways, Jackson told Poinsett he could have as many guns as he wanted. If nullifiers planned to resist with 12,000 bayonets, Jackson said, the federal government would greet them with 24,000. He was not playing around. Neither was Poinsett, who, by the way, was willing to fight dirty, telling Jackson that, quote, "hand grenades and small rockets are excellent weapons in a street fight, and I should like to have some of them," end quote. And this was supposed to be a gentleman. Now, Jackson and Poinsett were basically fighting against the legal state militia in South Carolina, what today we would refer to as the South Carolina National Guard. Today, when we use the term militia, we usually mean paramilitary groups or illegal groups of private citizens who take law enforcement into their own hands, kind of like the militia group involved in the killing of 2 protesters in Kenosha, Wisconsin in August. Oddly enough, any armed forces that Jackson and Poinsett organized would in some ways be paramilitary because the nullifiers control the state militia, again, the equivalent of the National Guard, because the nullification ordinance mandated that militia officers take a loyalty oath to South Carolina. Poinsett even said that the Unionists were afraid to turn up to practice military drills for him unless they could be absolutely assured that the federal government was behind them. Amidst these secret military preparations, Jackson also issued a public statement against nullification, which Unionists paid to have printed in as many papers as possible, hoping the news would help discourage sympathizers of nullification. Jackson also made a lengthy speech to Congress, justifying the right of the federal government to intervene for the good of the nation. Now, what was the good of the nation? Then, as now, people had different ideas about what this common good was. In 1832, most Americans would agree that it was both liberty and security, which, as we know, don't always go together. Many would say it was trying to develop manufacturing to compete with Britain. It was also trying to raise revenue to pay for infrastructure in the military. Many would also say it was the maintenance of the institution of slavery. In general, to the extent that the economy is part of the national good, a major issue was that business everywhere was at risk because of conflict over the tariff. South Carolina's refusal to collect the taxes and their threats to secede from the Union created a volatile economy that made Europeans nervous to trade with the United States and made it really risky to invest in new business ventures. Meanwhile, the cholera epidemic had swept the East Coast, which added to more economic uncertainty. It had been especially deadly in New York City, the commercial and financial hub of the nation. This slowed down trade not only because people were out of work, but also because port cities were restrictive about new arrivals. Merchants lost thousands of dollars a day during epidemics. Because the nation's economy was at risk, Jackson wanted to make sure he could put down the tax resistors in South Carolina, whether or not Congress approved the use of force. So, during the winter of 1833, Jackson made sure pro-Union South Carolina militia were organized and having regular drill practice to familiarize themselves with the newest guns made at the federal armories, which Jackson was shipping down to Charleston without congressional consent. This preparation, essentially for warfare, finally ended in March. On March 2nd, Jackson signed two pieces of legislation. One was a compromise that reduced tariffs by about 10% per year until 1842. The other was the Force Act, which legalized the preparations he and Poinsett had already begun. The act allowed the president to use military power to force South Carolina to comply with tariff collection. It also rejected the concept of individual states' rights to nullify federal law or to secede from the Union. For the next 2 weeks, the situation stayed really tense. Poinsett kept the Unionist militia leaders armed, and small skirmishes between nullifiers and federal supporters continued to break out. Finally, on March 15th, the South Carolina legislature backed down by rescinding the nullification ordinance. And as a symbolic gesture, they also nullified the Force Act several days later. So federal troops thus were not used in Charleston, and the nullification crisis ended. In the aftermath, South Carolina looked kind of crazy. Nullifiers, however, gained local strength, and all of this helped set the stage for later conflicts. Now, this event is usually talked about in the lead up to the Civil War, even though that was almost 30 years away, but it has other implications. It calls into question when it is appropriate to use federal force and when citizens should be forced to comply with national measures, issues that are still very relevant today. So let me back up and discuss the impetus for and debate around the force bill and draw some parallels. Not exact parallels, because again, history does not repeat itself despite the popular adage. So on January 16, 1833, almost 2 months before the Force Act, Jackson had made a speech to Congress asking for the power to provide for common defense and general welfare and, quote, to carry into effect the foregoing powers and all other powers vested in the government of the United States, end quote. This past summer, in response to the protests following the murder of George Floyd, President Trump basically used the same justification as Jackson when he said on June 1st, quote, if a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them, end quote. When Jackson made this request to use military and other force, whatever military and other force was necessary to suppress all forms of insurrection or civil disobedience within the states, he was both making an unprecedented grab for presidential power and revealing his belief in the importance of the national over states' rights. While in general today, it is mostly Democrats who oppose the use of federal force for law and order in cities, supporters of Jackson's request for force had different political allegiances. Some wanted a strong government, others just wanted South Carolina to cooperate with national measures. Historians have classed opinions about federal force into three groups. One group saw the American Republic as a federation of smaller state republics and correspondingly emphasized state sovereignty. They tended to sympathize with South Carolina, or at least feel like the federal government had no right to deploy force there. Another saw the United States as a national republic and correspondingly emphasized national sovereignty. This group supported federal force and believed states never had a right to nullify laws. Finally, a centrist bloc of partly federal, partly national Republicans focused on divided sovereignty and the compound nature of the American Republic. Because they also largely supported Jackson's force bill, it was passed. It actually passed 32-1, and that's because a bunch of opponents were not there for the final vote. Several of them were ill, possibly because of the cholera pandemic. So after it passed, several state governments offered up support. For example, Tennessee Governor William Carroll offered Jackson 8,000 to 10,000 volunteers in Tennessee to go against South Carolina. A Virginia newspaper actually said it was, quote, time for the people to awake, because federal force was perfectly compatible with republicanism. Now, the reason Congress authorized force at all is because a state was attempting to physically resist a federal law. They were not merely exercising free speech like protesters today. So in one sense, South Carolina's nullifiers have little to do with today's protests. The question of using force in South Carolina revolved around a state government taking issue with a federal law, not the federal government taking issues with activities in a state like today. People in South Carolina were protesting taxes, not social injustice. Also, federal force was used in cooperation with at least some officials in South Carolina. At the same time, however, they have much in common. First, they're both about the perception of force. Perception then and now mattered quite a lot. Jackson, who, as we know, Trump has compared himself to in the past, said of the force bill, quote, it is due to the country, it is due to me, as he was trying, end quote, as he was trying to get the Senate to pass the measure ahead of the compromise tariff bill. And he also said, quote, it would fully show to the world that the United States was not to be deterred by a faction which, if found in rebellion and treason, she was prepared to crush in an instant, end quote. So Jackson's all about his and the nation's appearance of strength. Likewise, the Trump campaign has been running numerous ads portraying American cities as overrun by violent left-wing mobs, which suggests that the president is motivated as much by the appearance of the federal response than its potential effectiveness. Order also was and is important for business. Just as riots today make business owners nervous, and President Trump referred specifically to the damage done to small business owners because of protests. In 1833, during the Nullification Crisis, a Baltimore merchant who was away on business in Europe wrote to an American friend that businessmen overseas who had heard about Jackson's military preparations in South Carolina were very confident about what that meant for the health of the US economy. They equated federal force with economic stability. The 1833 Force Act was short-lived. It was only in operation until the next session of Congress. So current presidents can't invoke it the way that they can the Insurrection Act. But it brings up age-old questions. From the beginning, Americans were afraid both of federal power and what their citizens were capable of. Early on, we had both George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who masqueraded as a champion of small government and states' rights, legitimizing the use of federal forces against US civilians. Andrew Jackson followed suit. Then, after the Civil War, when the federal government was used during Reconstruction to police state elections in former Confederate states and protect newly won civil rights, legislators from the former Confederate states pushed through the Posse Comitatus Act, which forbade the use of the US Army to enforce domestic policies because white Southerners had grown tired of federal troops forcing them to uphold civil rights for Blacks. So both the Nullification Crisis and the crises of 2020 are also about the clash of rights. When is it acceptable to declare states' rights privileges? During COVID, we've heard a lot of talk about the states' rights to control health policy and determine stay-at-home orders. And indeed, President Trump has given states free rein. Yet he also shows aggressive executive power in sidestepping Congress to deploy military force. Jackson, too, opposed national measures on some things. He interestingly refused national fasting days in observance of the cholera epidemic in June 1832. Jackson was against devoting too much funding to public works projects that he thought the states should take care of, and he waged war against the national bank. But he was also determined to use force to demonstrate federal strength, to uphold the union above all else. When then is using force justified? What sorts of action warrant the deployment of military power? Today, at the same time as we have the police tear gassing Black Lives Matter protesters, we have the president encouraging anti-lockdown protesters. Throughout history, this comes up time and time again. What behaviors are subject to policing by the federal government? In 1832, some white citizens of South Carolina felt their way of life threatened, felt the country's economic choices cutting into their chances of prosperity, just as anti-lockdown protesters and white nationalists do today. Nullifiers took issue with the national common good, with industrial protection and federal revenue generation, just as anti-lockdown protesters take issue with health measures for the common good, such as stay-at-home orders and virtual schooling. In a nation ostensibly committed to free speech, who is allowed to protest and under what conditions? Well, President Trump promises to put down Democrats who choose to exercise their First Amendment rights to protest in the streets if he wins re-election. Will it come to that? And finally, what is the common good? In South Carolina in 1832, was it lightly taxed trade with England, a thriving slave economy, a domestic manufacturing sector, the right to bear arms, the right to protest? Today, is it the right to choose whether to wear a mask, the right to shop, the right to be free from discrimination, the right to be healthy? This applies also to debates over mask wearing and protests to open the economy. We are in the midst of the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, and people feel attacked and squeezed. There's little federal policy related to health rules, and it's left to the states to make and regulate COVID mandates. This states' rights, federal power, common good clash, again, comes up time and time again. It's always a little different, like everything else in history. It always, though, revolves around the question of sovereignty. Which level of government has the last say on such matters of the common good? And who has the right to police what behaviors? Was President Jackson right to call for force in South Carolina? Is President Trump right to stop some protests and not others? There are no easy answers. For a nation ostensibly committed to freedom, we seem to spend a lot of time deploying military force and debating jurisdiction and who has power over whom. Thank you very much.